The horse had already put 2 handlers in the infirmary, and the third one hadn't even made it through the gate. Corporal Yates stood at the fence of the Canadian Forces Base Gagetown training paddock, his right arm in a fresh sling, watching his rear replacement try to clip a lead rope onto an animal that seemed to have made a personal decision to destroy everything within reach. The horse, a massive dark bay Hanoverian cross named Ghost, officially designated EQ-14 in the base's equestrian support program, was a study in contained catastrophe. His eyes were white-rimmed, his nostrils flared wide, and the sound coming from his chest was not the soft exhale of a horse at rest, but something lower, something that vibrated in the sternum of anyone standing close enough to feel it. Ghost had arrived at Gagetown 11 months ago, transferred from a decommissioned RCMP musical rides support facility in Ottawa, with paperwork describing him as a highly trained performance animal requiring experienced handling. What the paperwork had not described, what it could not describe, because the people who had written it either did not know or had chosen not to say, was that Ghost had not performed in 14 months. He had not tolerated a bit in 14 months. He had not allowed a human hand on his flank without responding with a violence that was entirely disproportionate to the gesture. 3 handlers, 2 infirmary trips, a veterinary team that had exhausted its standard protocols. The base animal behavior consultant, a young captain named Deirdre Favreau, had begun using the word euthanasia in her reports with increasing frequency. Warrant Officer Colin Stride, the senior training officer for the Equestrian Support Unit, was not a man who lost things. He had served 22 years, the last 9 with the Joint Task Force 2 support apparatus, moving through Kandahar, and later through assignments he still did not discuss at mess dinners. He was built like a man who had spent decades making himself useful in difficult terrain, compact, deliberate, with hands that were wider than they looked and eyes that moved in the constant, low-level surveillance pattern of someone who had never quite stopped working. He was the kind of officer who made younger soldiers uncomfortable without meaning to, who sat with his back to walls without thinking about it, who still woke at 0400 and found the silence of peacetime mildly suspicious. He had watched Ghost for 20 minutes now from the far end of the paddock, leaning against a post with his arms crossed and his coffee going cold in his hand. He was not watching the horse the way Favreau watched him, cataloging behaviors, taking notes in the margins of her clipboard. He was watching him the way he had once watched mountain passes in the dark, looking for the thing underneath the thing. The new handler, a young private named Beaumont, had finally given up. He dropped the lead rope and walked backwards out of the paddock, with the careful movements of a man who has accepted that his dignity is already lost and is now simply protecting his skeleton. Ghost watched him go, then turned and faced the empty middle of the paddock and began that same frantic circular movement. Not a canter, not a trot, but something jagged and purposeless, his hooves churning the dirt, his head low and swinging. "He's not dangerous," Stride said, to no one in particular. Favreau turned from her clipboard. "He's sent 3 people to the infirmary, sir." "He's terrified," Stride said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. She was good at her job, he could tell, thorough, careful, trained by the book. But she was 29 years old, and the book she had been trained by did not have a chapter on what he was looking at. "With respect, sir, the behavioral pattern indicates aggression, not fear. The lateral movement, the posturing. He's not looking for a fight," Stride said quietly. "He's looking for something. He just can't find it." Favreau said nothing. She wrote something on her clipboard. Stride pushed off the fence post and set his coffee cup on the rail. He moved along the fence line with his hands in his jacket pockets, not hurrying. He had nowhere to be. He had, in the strict sense, nowhere to be ever since he had taken the early release package 18 months ago and come back to New Brunswick because it was where he was from and because silence was something the province had in quantity. He was technically a civilian now. He had a small property outside Oromocto with a wood stove and a diesel generator and a workshop where he fixed machinery for the farms nearby. The base had a standing arrangement with him for maintenance work, diesel engines, hydraulic systems, whatever needed a careful hand and a willingness to work without conversation. He was reliable, he was quiet, he asked only for fair pay and to be left alone. He had come to fix a pump this morning. He had not come to stand at a paddock fence watching an animal come apart, and yet Ghost had stopped his frantic circling. He stood now in the center of the paddock, sides heaving, and he was watching Stride walk along the fence line with an attention that was different from the wide-eyed panic he had been showing for the past hour. Not calmer, exactly, but different. Focused. "Sir." Yates's voice came from behind him. "Sir, you really shouldn't. The animal isn't stable." Stride had already unlatched the gate. He heard Favreau say something urgent into her radio. He heard Beaumont inhale sharply. He did not hurry and he did not slow down. He walked through the gate the way he had once walked into rooms where the intelligence was bad and the options were limited, with the complete acceptance of whatever was on the other side. The paddock was quiet. The sound of the bass, trucks on the road, someone running a table saw in the maintenance bay, seemed to move away, muffled by distance. Stride stopped 6 meters from the horse and stood with his hands at his sides. Ghost's ears were forward. Stride did not extend a hand. He did not make a sound. He did not try to be smaller, to be less, to shrink himself into something the horse might find unthreatening. He simply stood there and let the animal look at him fully. Let the scent of him carry across the cold October air, the smell of diesel and sawdust and wood smoke, and something else beneath that, something older, the residue of years and geography and particular kinds of stress that left marks on the body that soap could not entirely remove. The horse took one step toward him. Favreau, watching from the fence, made a sound that she would later insist was not a gasp. Stride reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, slowly, and withdrew a small object, a worn leather strap, dark with old oil, with a brass ring at one end. He held it out, not offering it to the horse, just holding it at his side so the animal could see it, could smell it. Ghost went absolutely still. His breathing, which had been ragged and loud, slowed. His head came up, and then dropped, not in submission, but in the particular way of an animal processing something that has struck a very deep chord in the oldest part of its brain. A sound came from him, low, resonant, nothing like the aggressive noise he had been making. It was a sound of recognition so profound it bordered on anguish. Stride said a word, one word, a name, Reeve. The effect was total and immediate. The horse that had terrorized 3 handlers and exhausted a veterinary team and earned the word euthanasia in official correspondence walked forward and put his enormous head against the chest of the warrant officer who fixed diesel engines for a living. He stood there, trembling slightly, the way a very large thing trembles when a very large tension goes out of it all at once. His eyes, which had been wide and white-rimmed for 11 months, were soft. Stride put one hand on the horse's neck. He didn't speak. His shoulders moved once, in the way of a man controlling something that wants to surface. The fence line was silent. Warrant officer, retired. Stride let himself be led back to the paddock gate without taking his hand from the horse's neck. The horse followed him like a shadow, his hooves quiet on the packed dirt, his enormous body close enough that his breath fogged the back of Stride's jacket. Favreau had her clipboard pressed to her chest, forgotten. Yates was standing, with his uninjured arm braced on the top rail, his mouth slightly open. Beaumont, who had gone back for coffee after his retreat and returned to find something he did not understand, stood with his cup halfway to his mouth and forgotten. It was Major Adeline Poirier, the base's commanding officer for the support battalion, who had been called to the paddock by Favreau's radio call, who spoke first. "Mr. Stride." Her voice was measured, careful, the voice of a senior officer who had learned to be very precise with language when a situation did not yet have a category. "I think you have some explaining to do." Stride looked at her over the horse's neck. His pale gray eyes were steady. "Probably," he said. "That animal has been unmanageable since his arrival. Our best handlers—" "He wasn't unmanageable," Stride said. "He was waiting." Poirier's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She was a careful woman, methodical, and she had seen enough in her career to know that the simplest explanation for an extraordinary thing was usually the truest one. "Waiting," she repeated. "For someone who knew him." Stride's hand moved in a slow, steady motion along the horse's jaw. "His name isn't Ghost. That's not his name. His file designates him. His name is Reeve, and he's been my horse for 6 years." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room, or a paddock, reassembles itself around a new fact. Poirier was not a woman who lost composure easily. She had spent 15 years managing the complex administrative and logistical machinery of a large base, and she had dealt with situations that were strange, difficult, and occasionally outside the scope of her training. But this, a civilian contractor, a man she had known for 8 months, as a reliable, unremarkable presence who fixed her base's machinery and asked for nothing. Standing in the middle of her paddock with his hand on an animal that had been a waking institutional nightmare, claiming the horse as his own, this required a moment. "Sergeant Major Kowalski," she said to her senior NCO, who had appeared behind her at some point, "I need the full file on EQ-14, not the summary. Everything. Transfer records, original intake documentation, handler notes, going back to his first entry into the system. And I want to know who Walter Stride is, his full background, full." Kowalski, who had the expression of a man who had seen enough not to be surprised by very much, nodded once and left. Stride watched him go. His expression was that of a man who had been carrying a particular weight for a long time and has just felt someone else put a hand on it, not taking it away, but at least acknowledging its existence. "I'd appreciate it," he said quietly, "if Reeve could be moved to a single stall isolation unit while you look. He's been in a group facility. It hasn't suited him." Poirier looked at him for a long moment. "You understand I can't simply release a Canadian Forces asset to a civilian based on—" "I know." Stride's voice was even. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to give him a quiet stall and some decent hay while you figure out what you're looking at." He paused. "He's earned that much." Poirier thought for exactly 2 seconds, then gave a precise nod. "Captain Favreau, see to the horse." The file for EQ-14, call sign Ghost, was thin in the places where files should be thick and heavily annotated in the places where people were trying to explain something they did not understand. The performance records from the RCMP facility described an animal of exceptional training and temperament, scores that put him in the top 2% of working equines in the federal inventory, followed by a hard stop at month 31 and a notation that read, simply, "Handler transition required due to operational restructuring." Operational restructuring, the language of bureaucracy for something that had no clean language at all. Kowalski placed the file on Poirier's desk and pointed to a section near the back. "There's a redacted transfer note here, ma'am. The horse came to the RCMP facility from a civilian placement registry. Before that, classified. Unit designation blacked out. Handler name blacked out. Originating program blacked out." Poirier looked at the black bars running across the page like censor tape. In her experience, redaction at this level meant one of two things: a mistake, or something that someone with significant authority had wanted very much to disappear. "What can you tell me about Stride?" Kowalski's expression was carefully neutral. "Walter James Stride. Born in Fredericton, 1961. CAF enlisted 1980. Served with the Royal Canadian Regiment through the 80s, attached to various support functions through the 90s. The file gets thin around 2001. He paused. "Very thin, meaning whatever he was doing after 2001, it wasn't in a uniform anyone has a record of on file at NDHQ. There are deployment markers, pay continuations, benefit accruals, but no operational reports, no unit designations, nothing that tells you where he was or what he was doing." Kowalski set a second page on the desk. "He took the early release package 18 months ago. Medical grounds, but the medical file is also redacted." "Yes, ma'am." Poirier sat back. The afternoon light through her office window was the low, flat light of New Brunswick in October, and it made everything look older than it was. She thought about the man in the paddock, the way he had walked through the gate without hesitation, the way the horse had gone still the moment he spoke. She had commanded enough people over her career to know the difference between a man performing confidence and a man operating from a place where fear had been processed so thoroughly it simply did not arise the same way anymore. "He served," she said. "It was not a question." "Longer than the file admits to, ma'am. That's my read." She nodded. "Find out what you can quietly and get me someone at NDHQ who can lift a redaction." The call came to her office at 2200 that night. Unknown Ottawa number. The voice on the other end was unhurried, with the quality of a person who had not had to explain themselves to very many people in a very long time. "Major Poirier. Not a question. Speaking. I understand you've been making inquiries about a civilian contractor and a horse." Poirier kept her voice level. "I have an unresolved asset situation and an unidentified." "The situation is resolved," the voice said. "The horse is where it belongs. The man is who he says he is. I would encourage you not to pull that particular thread any further." "With respect," Poirier said, and she meant the words, "I have an obligation to understand what is happening on my base." A pause. Not the pause of someone choosing evasion, but the pause of someone deciding how much truth was necessary. Walter Stride served this country for nearly 30 years in capacities that are not going to be discussed on an unsecured line, or frankly in any official venue you have access to. The horse was his working partner for 6 years. When Stride was pulled out of his last assignment, badly, the animal was transferred out under a different name because the people who made that decision thought it was the kindest thing. They were wrong. They usually are. Another pause. The horse is retired. Stride is retired. Let them be retired together. That's not a request. The line went dead. Poirier set the phone down on her desk and looked at the wall for a long moment. Walter Stride. Not just a man who fixed engines. She drove out to his property the next morning herself. It was a small place off a county road outside Oromocto. A white clapboard house, a workshop behind it, a modest barn that was newer than the house and better maintained than either. The wood smoke smell reached her before she was out of the truck. He was in the barn when she arrived, working a piece of leather with a block of saddle soap. He had a second stall open now, clean straw down, a water bucket full. The horse, Reeve, was in the adjacent stall, eating hay with the slow, rhythmic contentment of an animal that has finally stopped being afraid. Stride looked up when she came in. He didn't seem surprised to see her, but he didn't seem to have expected her either. He set down the leather and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Major, Mr. Stride." She stopped in the middle of the barn aisle. The smell of hay and leather and old wood was strong and not unpleasant. "I received a phone call last night. I'd imagine you did. They told me to stop asking questions." "Good advice," he said, with the ghost of something that might, under better circumstances, have been a smile. "I can't do that," she said. "I have a responsibility to the people under my command and to the institution. If there's something on my base I don't understand, I need to understand it." She looked at him steadily. "Not for the file, for me." He was quiet for a moment. Reeve shifted in the adjacent stall, and Stride glanced toward him with the automatic attention of a man who has spent years tracking the movements of a partner without thinking about it. Then he spoke. "We were attached to a joint Canadian Allied intelligence support function. I can't tell you the name because it doesn't have one anymore. We worked, Reeve and I worked, for about 6 years running routes in country where dogs draw too much attention, but a man on a horse is just a man on a horse." He said it simply, the way a person describes a job when the job has been over long enough to lose its specific danger but not its weight. "Mountain country. You know the kind." She did. She had deployed twice. Last run went wrong. Ambush. The kind of ambush that tells you someone knew your route before you did. He reached up and touched his left side through his jacket, the same instinctive gesture of a man who has stopped noticing he does it. "Reeve took rounds. I took rounds. The difference is that Reeve didn't go down, and because Reeve didn't go down, I made it out. He carried me through 4 hours of mountain dark to the extraction point. 4 hours. Hit twice, with me on his back." His voice was steady, but something in it had thinned. "When I was in the trauma unit in Germany, they told me he hadn't made it. They said it to be kind. They said a lot of things to be kind." He looked at the wall. "By the time I was out, they'd moved him, changed his name, put him in a program where they could tell themselves he was being cared for. What they couldn't fix, what nobody figured out, was that a horse doesn't care about facilities, doesn't care about training scores or veterinary approval. He cared about one thing. And when that thing wasn't there, he went somewhere else inside himself." The barn was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce trees at the edge of the property. "He wasn't aggressive," Stride said. "He was grieving." Poirier stood with that for a moment. She was a careful person, not given to sentiment in professional situations, but she was also a person who had spent enough time around soldiers to understand that the things they didn't say were usually the most important things of all. "How did you find him?" "I didn't." Stride almost smiled. "I came to fix your pump." She looked at him. He held her gaze. "I'd been here 8 months and I never went near the paddock. I stayed in my lane. I had an agreement with myself. That chapter's closed, you don't look back at it. And then last week, the pump I was fixing was the one on the east side of the maintenance bay, and the east side of the maintenance bay backs onto the paddock fence, and I heard." He stopped. He looked at the floor. When he looked up, something in his expression was unguarded in a way it probably had not been in a very long time. "I heard him. The sound he makes when he's frightened. I'd know that sound if I heard it at the bottom of a lake." The silence held. "He's home," Stride said. The words were not dramatic. They were simply the truth, offered plainly. 3 weeks later, on a cold morning when the first real snow of the season was sitting in the spruce branches and making the base look improbably clean and quiet, Major Poirier convened a small gathering on the same paddock where it had all started. No ceremony, no press, no flags. 6 people, herself, Kowalski, Favreau, Yates, Beaumont, and a civilian liaison from NDHQ who had driven from Ottawa and did not give his name to anyone. Stride stood at the paddock fence with Reeve beside him, not on a lead, just beside him, the way a dog walks next to someone it trusts. The horse wore a simple halter, and his old working bridle had been found in storage and returned, the leather newly oiled, but the brass ring still dark with old use. He looked, Favreau thought, like a different animal, not because anything about him had changed but because all the static was gone. The NDHQ liaison handed Stride an envelope. Inside was a single page, EQ-14, designated ghost, officially retired from Canadian Forces inventory, assigned to permanent private care. A second page detailed something modest but real, a retroactive care allowance, backdated to the date of transfer. Stride looked at both pages for a moment without speaking. Yates, his arm out of the sling now, the bruising faded to yellow, stepped forward. He was a compact, serious young man from Manitoba who had come to the equestrian support unit because he had grown up with horses and believed in them. He looked at Stride the way young soldiers sometimes look at old ones when they have finally understood what they are looking at. "Sir," he said. He extended his hand, not to Stride but toward Reeve. Palm up, easy, the way someone who knows horses offers a hand without any agenda. Reeve dropped his nose to Yates's palm and breathed in. Then he drew back and looked at Stride as if checking. "He's all right," Stride said. "He's decent." Reeve turned back and allowed Yates's hand to rest briefly on his jaw. Poirier came to stand beside Stride. She looked at Reeve, then at the old warrant officer who was watching his horse with an expression she would not describe to anyone because it was not hers to describe. "The unit has a request," she said. Stride looked at her. "We have 7 horses in that facility and handlers ranging from competent to excellent. What we don't have," she paused, choosing words, "what we don't have is someone who understands what a working partnership actually is, not the mechanics, the other part." She held his gaze. "We'd like your help with that. Not a contract, not a title. Come when you can. Leave when you need to. Bring Reeve if it suits him." She paused. "We could learn something." Stride was quiet for a long moment. Reeve shifted beside him, his shoulder warm against Stride's arm. "Seasonal roads are getting bad," Stride said finally. "His generator runs better in the cold than the heat. The pump on the east side is going to need new seals before March." He looked at her sideways. "I suppose I'll be around." Poirier allowed herself a small, dry smile. "Good enough." The snow had begun again by the time they dispersed. Light, early winter snow, the kind that settles without sound. Stride walked Reeve back along the paddock fence toward the gate, the horse's hooves leaving clean prints in the thin white covering on the ground. They walked without hurry. The old warrant officer and the animal who had carried him out of the dark. Both of them quiet. Both of them finally in a place where they did not need to be anything other than what they were.